The current debate about owning and using a gun in the Christian church, I think, overlooks the fact that Jesus was in favor of loving enemies and not killing them. Now that is very radical and not easy to accept, I see that. But in Luke 22:35 we have an interesting incident there. Jesus said to them, the disciples, "When I sent you out without money, without belt and bag and sandals, you didn't lack anything, did you?" And they said, "No, nothing." Note that they didn't have any swords with them. It would seem that today normal operating procedure must include the carrying of a gun at all times. Jesus had not sent them out with a sword, quite expressly. Now, why was that? Well, he goes on then to relate a very tiny incident in the life of Christ, but a very significant one. He said to them, "But now, whoever has a money belt is to take it along with him, likewise a bag, and whoever has no sword is to sell his coat and buy a sword." Oh, so now Jesus then is advocating the use of violence and killing, contrary to the rest of his teaching. That's not at all the point here. The next word, rar in Greek, gamma, alpha, rho, rar, is the explanatory word. It's the unpacking word. It explains what is meant by the statement just given. Why are they now to have a sword, contrary to earlier practice? For it says, that which is written in the book of Isaiah 53, verse 12, about Jesus must be fulfilled. So directly then related to that prophecy in Isaiah 53:12, where it says that Jesus, the servant of God, the suffering servant, was reckoned amongst the freedom fighters, if you like, the brigands, the rascals, the bad ones, the bad guys. He was reckoned among them. How is that going to be fulfilled? Only if his people are found to be carrying a sword. And so this is specifically so that particular prophecy can be fulfilled. That's what Jesus says. "For I tell you that this which is written," the Scripture, and therefore stands to be absolute truth, "must be fulfilled in me, that he was numbered with the transgressors. For that which refers to me must have its fulfillment." And they said, "Okay then, Lord, we got a couple of swords here. Will that do?" And he said, virtually, "Joke over." Now, 2 swords are nothing against the might of Rome. That's absurd. These 2 swords are simply for the fulfillment of that prophecy that he's treated as though he's just one of the street fighters. 2 swords is enough to get that fulfilled. So this is a little humor here, but on no account can this be taken to mean that Jesus advocates the use of the sword. He plainly doesn't. Now, people will, of course, immediately rise to the defense of the other position by going to the Old Testament. If you advocate the use of violence as the Old Testament advocates it, then you'd better be ready to do aggressive wars as well as defensive ones. There are times when it would have been absolute sin not to go out to war. It would have been sin not to kill men, women, and children. But remember that physical circumcision was mandated for Jew and Gentile in Genesis 17. Is that true in Paul? Of course not. There's a radical, fundamental change between the 2 covenants. What was obedience in the old becomes disobedience in some cases in the new. So one cannot plead then the Old Testament anyway. David himself was a man of violence. For that reason, it says expressly, he was not allowed to build the temple. There was something less than the perfect standard in the use of violence. Reflected even David, great as he was, supreme king of Israel, was not allowed to build the temple because of the blood shed by him in warfare. And so one must stick, I think, with the very difficult, uncompromising command of Jesus to love one's enemies. Now, if one can love one's enemies and kill them at the same time, I say go for it. But if you have any doubt at all, that is, you view the man with the blood coming out of his head on the floor, you've just killed him to defend yourself. If you have any doubt at all about that being love or not, love, remember, does no harm, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law, then be extremely cautious, because this could be incriminating disobedience to Jesus. And that's a serious issue, because salvation, we remember from Hebrews 5:9, is given to those who obey Jesus. As John 3:36 has it, he who believes in Jesus is doing well. He who disobeys Jesus, note the opposite then of faith and disobedience, the 2 poles, two sides of the coin. He who disobeys Jesus, the wrath of God is hanging over him. Yes, the New Testament is profoundly disturbing, profoundly radical. Paul is profoundly radical. But we who are Christians are trying to take the words of Jesus seriously as a matter of salvation. The defensive sword, it has been argued, is valid in the teaching of Jesus, but that cannot be so, because when Peter then used one of those swords, Peter is rebuked for using the defensive sword. It's precisely the defensive sword. In a later episode where Jesus then is met with the opposition, with the enemy, he's quite clear about the defensive sword. It's nonsense to say that Jesus defends the defensive sword, because in Matthew chapter 26, verse 51, we read this: "Behold, one of those who were with Jesus reached out and drew out his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, 'Put your sword back into its place, for all those who take up the sword will perish by the sword.'" It seems to me that's a very much all-encompassing, uncompromising statement about those who take up the sword. And so if Christianity is about obedience, as it clearly is, Hebrews 5:9, those who obey Jesus get salvation, those who disobey him don't. If his words and his teachings are the absolute criterion of success in the Christian life, then we need to take this verse in Matthew 26:52 very seriously, that even the defensive sword, however well-intentioned, is condemned. At that point, then, the question of life and death is in God's hands. It may be that a person has to die rather than retaliate. So be it. The next second of consciousness, after the sleep of death, would bring him back in the resurrection and to immortality. So that is the sum total, then, of the very radical pacifist view of Jesus, which has been understood by many, many commentators in our time and for many years before. Certainly worth reflecting upon. A Christian should examine himself and say, am I in obedience to Christ if I'm holding my gun ready to defend myself against an intruder? That might not be a Christian idea at all. It certainly should be subjected to very close examination. Paul is the one who later goes on to say that it's the state that wields the sword, and we're grateful for that. Paul used his own Roman citizenship to defend himself, and a Christian can do that. The state then bears the sword not in vain. The state, he says, is the avenger of God, and we're very grateful and thankful for that. However, the Christian is not to take vengeance expressly. So the state and the Christian are not the same in this regard. We are not of this world. I think from the New Testament's very radical point of view, the Christians are to remain aloof and away from the wars of the world. That's what the wars of the world, that's what they do. The problem was when Luther decided that you could wear two hats. You could wear the hat of the state as avenger and the hat of the Christian who is forbidden to take vengeance. That becomes impossible. We're meeting there an indissoluble problem. And so it's much better then to take the non-violent, non-intruding into the world's affairs point of view, to remain aloof politically.